Although the slaves were freed in 1863 by Abraham Lincoln, life was still very difficult for the newly freed people. Many didn't have homes or jobs, and the continued racism they encountered from the Southern society made life harder. Once the Civil War ended, Reconstruction began, as the American people explored what it meant for all people to be free. It was a time not only to reconstruct the buildings and infrastructure across the South, but also to heal the country and create a society where all men are created equal. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment gave male citizens equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment allowed all men to vote. Even though the law said that the slaves were free, the popular opinion in the South was still one of hatred and animosity towards them by much of the white population. Many people didn't like these amendments, and from this the Ku Klux Klan was formed. The group was based on the idea that one race is more superior than the other. After the Reconstruction in 1877, the Jim Crow laws were introduced into the southern states. The Jim Crow laws set the standards for how the races encountered one another in the South. In 1965, there were 14,400 white people and 15,100 African American people living in Selma, Alabama. African Americans had the right to vote. However, only 2% of eligible voters actually had a voting license. On February 3, 1965, a group of protesters explored the possibility of changing the law through nonviolent tactics by marching around the courthouse for voting rights in Marion, a town just outside of Selma, Alabama. There they encountered state troopers who were present to prevent the people from marching. In the exchange between the state troopers and the marchers, 700 children who left school to attend the march were arrested for missing school, along with James Orange, the leader of the march. On February 18, 1965, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference arranged a march up to the city jail, where James Orange was being held in custody. They met at Zion Chapel Methodist Church in Marion for a short prayer before the march. On the way to the jail, 50 state troopers attacked the marchers with cattle prods and nightsticks. Jimmy Lee Jackson, along with his grandfather and mother, took shelter in a local diner. Some of the state troopers followed them in, where they began to attack the family. Jimmy Lee Jackson tried to protect his grandfather and mother. Jimmy Lee encountered an officer who pushed him to the ground. When he got back up, he was shot twice in the stomach by James Fowler, a state trooper. Jimmy Lee Jackson left the diner alive, but 8 days later, he died. Jimmy Lee's funeral was attended by Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Local activist Albert Turner suggested that protesters, quote, carry Jimmy's body to George Wallace and dump it on the steps of the Capitol, end quote. This is what inspired the march from Selma to Montgomery. The activist groups, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, also known as the SCLC, along with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as the SNCC, helped to coordinate the march that would take place on Sunday, March 7, 1965, from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. The SCLC had helped to organize and lead the Montgomery bus boycott. The SNCC had coordinated lunch counter boycotts across the South, as well as holding a voting registration campaign prior to the march. Together, the SCLC and the SNCC made Selma, Alabama their main focus because of Sheriff Jim Clark's brutal police tactics. They knew that Sheriff Clark would not hesitate to make a scene, and their encounter with him would attract national media attention. Hosea Williams, the head of the SNCC, alongside John Lewis, the head of the SCLC, led the march. Beginning at Brown Chapel, 600 people set out to march from Selma to Montgomery. As they approached the end of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, there was a suspenseful exchange between the marchers and the state troopers. The troopers told them to disperse, but the marchers stood strong.
Be detrimental to your safety to continue this march, and I'm saying that this is an unlawful assembly. You have to disperse. You are ordered to disperse, go home, or go to your church.
When they didn't disperse, the encounter became violent as the state troopers put on their gas masks and sprayed tear gas while other officers rode on horseback towards the marchers. Running with fear, the marchers were beat down with clubs and other harsh objects. As marcher Amelia Boynton laid injured on the bridge, someone told Sheriff Clark to call an ambulance, to which he replied, I'm not going to call any ambulance for anybody. Let the buzzards eat 'em. All of this was recorded on the news and broadcast to the nation. Marcher Cheyenne Webb shares, on that day, quote, there was an outburst of tear gas and I saw people being beat, and I began to run home as fast as I could. And as I began to run home, I saw horses behind me, and I'll never forget, a freedom fighter picked me up, Hosea Williams, and I told him to put me down. He wasn't running fast enough. And I ran, and I ran, and I ran. This exchange was known as Bloody Sunday. Reverend Paul McDaniel reflects upon his decision to come from New Jersey to Selma to march.
Baptist ministers went to a meeting on Monday, and we had lunch together. We talked about it, and we were just so moved by it, by the way folks would treat others, the hatred that was seen, and yet how these folks endured the violence and hostility. So even as we had lunch, we decided to go to Selma the next day.
In response to the violence, Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. set up another march that would take place on the following Tuesday. White and African Americans from all over reached out to the marchers in Selma. Dr. King led the march. Once again, at the end of the bridge, state troopers stood lined up. But instead of telling them to disperse, Dr. King stopped and kneeled down to pray. Then he turned the group around and everyone left. That night, 3 white ministers were attacked for participating in the march. One of the ministers, James Reeb, from Boston, Massachusetts, was killed. 400 people came to his funeral. President Lyndon B. Johnson ordered the Alabama National State Guard to escort the marchers on their exploration from Selma to Montgomery. On Sunday, March 21, 1965, 3,200 people set out to walk 54 miles to Montgomery, Alabama's state capital. Along the way, they camped out. Over the course of 4 days, their number had grown to 25,000 people when they reached Montgomery, Alabama. When I asked Reverend Paul McDaniel if he was scared to march, he recalls,
And we were not fearful because we had the protection of the government. Yeah. And it was a sense to have that sort of togetherness, young and old, black and white, rich and poor. It was just a sense maybe of what we think the kingdom would be like. Yeah.
At the end of the march, Dr. King gave his speech at the steps of the state capitol.
However frustrating the hour, it will not be long, because truth crushed earth will rise again.
Yes, sir.
How long? Not long.
Yes, sir.
Because no lie can live forever.
Yes, sir.
The exchange between the nonviolent protesters and local law enforcement led Lyndon B. Johnson to sign the Voting Rights Act on August 6, 1965. The Voting Rights Act made the use of literacy tests illegal. Federal overseers were also sent to areas where there were 50% or less of registered African American voters. They were present in case the voters encountered any violations in the new law. Because of the Voting Rights Act, the number of African American voters increased across the nation. Mississippi saw a rise from 6% to 59%. Although great improvements have been made, there are still people being denied the right to vote. In the spirit of Dr. King, those who marched and died for the cause, let us explore ways to continue the march until everyone has a voice and a vote in our great country.
Oh, this the light of mine.